welcome to Talking Everything Bible, and welcome to Samuel. Now, first thing I want you to notice is I'm not saying First and Second Samuel, and that's because actually Samuel is one book. There is no First and Second Samuel. So that was split when it was translated into Greek, and because it was such a massive book, they gave one monastery a half book and another monastery and the second half. It was supposed to be put back together, but it never did, and so it became First and Second Samuel when it was translated into Greek. And even though Samuel contributed to the book, Samuel didn't write First and Second Samuel. As a matter of fact, the book was not called Samuel in Hebrew. And it doesn't refer to any person named Samuel. In Hebrew, the name of the book is Shemuel, which means God has heard, or the name of God. So literally translated, the book was actually the continued story of God after the Torah. And remember that after the Israelites got out of Egypt, went around the Sinai in circles, went into Israel, remember that they're first ruled by judges. God sets up judges, and of course we have first the book of Judges, and now we're going to turn to the transition between judges and monarchy. And of course, the people come up with the monarchy. It wasn't God's choice, it was the people's choice. So that's kind of what, especially the first book of Samuel, that's what we're going to see, is we're going to see that transitioning from a nation of judges to a nation of monarchy and prophets. Okay? It is believed that the translator took the word Shemuel, which sounds like the word Samuel, and therefore named the book Samuel, because it's a lot about a person named Samuel. So again, this happened in later translations, but that's not what the book was called. It's widely believed and accepted by Jewish scholars that the book of Samuel had several authors and was a collection of historical accounts, public records, and even oral tradition and stories that were put together in Solomon's day by the scribes of the time. Some accounts say that the prophet Jeremiah and Ezra were the main contributors to the book of Samuel. But we also know that much of Samuel is written by Gad, the prophet Gad, and we will read more about him. But Gad was a prophet and advisor to King David in Israel, and he's first mentioned in chapter 22 of Samuel's, and you'll see him there, and he makes several prophecies for David, for David's reign, and guides David into several things. And later, after David, Gad kind of sits down and records a lot of those events. So much of what we have about David comes from Gad, and which kind of makes sense because Gad was there in person and witnessed a lot of the account. And the other big contributor to the book of Samuel is the prophet Nathan. Linda, why don't we start with you, since you're to my top left? Would you read 1 Samuel chapter 1, verses 1 through 3.
1 through 3.
1 through 3.
Now there was a certain man from Ramathaim Zophim, from the hill country of Ephraim, and his name was Elkanah, the son of Jeroham, the son of Elihu, the son of Tohu, the son of Zoph, and Ephraimite. And he had 2 wives. The name of one was Hannah, the name of the other Peninnah. Peninnah had children, but Hannah had no children. Now this man would go up from his city yearly to worship and to sacrifice to the Lord of hosts in Shiloh. And the 2 sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, were priests to the Lord there.
Okay, so basically we start with some introduction, and we meet Elkanah, and the manner of his introduction, along with the ample genealogy and the mention of his 2 wives, Hannah and Peninnah. Of course, Hannah and Peninnah become important characters, as we'll see. And this whole introduction suggests that Elkanah, or Elkanah, however you want to pronounce it, was a man of some importance. In a sense, then, the book of Samuel opens not just with the story of Elkanah, Hannah, and Peninnah, but with new beginnings for Israel. So what are we to make of Elkanah's 2 wives? Polygamy? Having more than 1 wife? Well, polygamy was practiced by kings and nobles in the period, but was not common to ordinary people, no more than it is common to ordinary people today. Okay, that's a misconception about Israel, and those ancient times, that polygamy was everywhere. Polygamy was only allowed to the very elite. Basically, later on, just kings they were allowed to have more than, and especially in this particular period. So it's for Israel, it is the Torah did not, condone polygamy, but it had some exceptions. And one of the exceptions was that if somebody married a woman that could not have children, then you were allowed to marry another woman just for the purpose of having children. And that's probably the case here. And so Hannah cannot have children, so he also marries Peninnah. And we'll find out that Peninnah is a marriage of convenience for children, because he abuses her quite a bit. So she is not a loved wife by any means. Okay. Elkanah was a commoner, even if he was a prominent one. So again, the exception for polygamy comes into play here, in that he was allowed to marry Peninnah because Hannah was barren. Neither, as we will read on, neither one was a real happy person in their circumstance. One, Hannah, because she was barren and jealous of Peninnah because she could have children, of course, and so there was a lot of conflict there. Elkanah would take his family year after year to worship and sacrifice to the Lord Almighty at Shiloh. These were regular religious festivals of ancient times, and they weren't just for Israel. Ancient Egyptian came and celebrated at there also. And so these annual festivals were quite common, and he was known to go there every year. Three or more characters are also mentioned in the introduction. Eli and his two sons, Hophni and Phinehas. And it's mentioned that they were priests of the Lord in Shiloh. And that's going to become extremely significant, okay? All these things I'm saying may not seem significant, but in these first three verses, these introductions are going to play out, because, as I said, Shiloh was the Las Vegas of cities, okay? All nations came there to celebrate festivals. It was kind of a crazy place, and you'll see that the sons fall right into that and thoroughly abuse their priesthood. All right, well, let's, Jim, why don't you go ahead and pick us up with verses 4 through 7.
Okay. Whenever the day came for Elkanah to sacrifice, he would give portions of the meat to his wife, Peninnah, and to all her sons and daughters. But to Hannah he gave a double portion, because he loved her. And the Lord had closed her wound. And because the Lord had closed her wound, her rival kept provoking her in order to irritate her. This went on year after year. Whenever Hannah went up to the house of the Lord, her rival provoked her till she wept and would not eat.
Okay, thank you. All right, so we get a little bit more insight now and in what happens at Shiloh. Verse 4, the action gets underway. Though difficult to capture with precisely in the English translation, the Hebrew syntax suggests that verse 4 through 7 make up one lengthy sentence, and with a digression in the middle. The sentence begins with a statement that on a particular day, Elkanah sacrificed, and concludes with the statements that Hannah wept and would not eat. In the middle of the digression is the digression explaining the cause of Hannah's misery. Year after year at festival time, Elkanah would give portions of the feast to Peninnah and to each of her children, and then the leftovers to Hannah. Just what kind of portion Elkanah gave to Hannah, we don't know, but it seems better portions actually to Hannah, but she would refuse them. She wouldn't accept them, because why do you think that is? Why do you think she refused his offer to her of better sacrifice, you might say?
Well, because year after year she's being teased about how she's not able to have children, and that she's given this double portion, which there's no possible way she could eat by herself. and she has no one else to give it to. It just, this kind of circular, like, here, you're getting the best portion. It's like, well, what good is that if I can't share it with my own offspring?
That's good insight. I like that.
Wonder, I'm a little bit stuck between the one translation that I happened to be reading said, although he loved Hannah, he would give her only one choice portion. And so I'm like, is it a smaller portion or is it a bigger portion? Like, I'm still a little bit on the fence, but in either event, it feels like trying to almost like trying to make up for a big lack. Yeah.
I think that I agree with you. And by the way, you're not alone in that. There's a note here that English translators were not able to figure out what was meant by the better or more than the other portion, whether that was a good thing or a bad thing. In the Hebrew, it's not clear. Okay. So, yeah, different translations have different things. But I think I agree with you. I think, he's trying to appease Hannah, and it's like putting coals on the fire for her. The fact that she couldn't have children was, especially at that time, children were everything, especially a male child was everything to a woman. And if a woman couldn't give a male child to her husband, she was basically an outcast. However, the Bible says he loved her and was trying to appease her, but it just, she would not eat, she wouldn't drink, she was just miserable.
A podcast that I was listening to and talked about the inheritance that God promised Abraham and his descendants, and how this podcast was discussing kind of Genesis into Exodus, but same concept, that children were incredibly important, not just in the be fruitful and multiply manner, but because they represented God's blessing and God's inheritance. And so for a woman to be barren was even more coals on the fire, so to speak.
Yeah, and I don't think Hannah despised Peninnah, but you couldn't help it. And there was definitely jealousy there, and I mean, your husband marries another gal. I mean, how could you not? But I mean, it was allowed legally, but certainly it wouldn't have been advantageous for the relationship. Okay. Yeah. Okay, Peggy, would you read verse 8, please?
Elkanah, her husband, would say to her, Hannah, why are you weeping? Why don't you eat? Why are you downhearted? Don't I mean more to you than 10 sons?
Boy, that sounds like more colds, doesn't it? Yeah. Whatever the precise nature of Hannah's portion, Elkanah's motivation is clear enough. He hopes to soothe Hannah's wounded spirit because the Lord has closed her womb. Not so Peninnah, but not so Peninnah's, Hannah reveals. Her every inclination, especially at festival time, is to rub as much salt into Hannah's wound as possible. Peninnah's own pain may have been considerable if, as suggested above, she became Elkanah's wife mostly for reproductive purposes. And so on that day, Hannah wept and would not eat. Don't I mean more to you than 10 sons? Elkanah matches his well-intended actions with well-intended words, but both prove ineffectual. In fact, Elkanah's attempt to fix Hannah's problem through this action may have only deepened her despair. Her rival doesn't care, and even her loving husband doesn't really understand. In her pain, several courses of action are open to her. Given her favored status with Elkanah, Hannah could meet Peninnah fire with fire. You have children, I have our husband's love, she might say, for instance. Or she could follow Elkanah's implicit suggestion and flee the pain through sublimation. As the next section reveals, however, the response was neither fight nor flight, but she takes her pain to God. And that's, of course, becomes very significant. You're going to see that this all ties in and becomes important. Even her pain and her suffering becomes hugely important later on. Okay, Tim, would you read verses 9 through 11, and we'll end with those.
Once when they had finished eating and drinking in Shiloh, Hannah stood up. Now Eli the priest was sitting on his chair by the doorpost of the Lord's house. In her deep anguish, Hannah prayed to the Lord, weeping bitterly. And she made a vow, saying, Lord Almighty, if you will only look on your servant's misery and remember me, and not forget your servant, but give her a son, then I will give him to the Lord for all the days of his life, and no razor will ever be used on his head.
Okay, so it's bargaining time. Before we're given any further information on what Hannah arose to do, the narrator digresses to recall another individual mentioned in passing in verse 3, namely Eli. He's described as a priest, by which we should understand that he was actually the chief priest at this time, because he's sitting in his chair by the doorpost of the Lord's house. Weeping and praying, Hannah makes a vow. The modern reader may find Hannah's vow surprising in a couple of respects. First, a woman who has suffered so much from not having a child would not be give him up once he was born. Second, Hannah's "if you, then I" proposition might sound like a crass bargaining with God, but the making of vows was a regular feature in petitionary prayer of the time. Was Hannah's offer solely her idea? Perhaps, but if we may be permitted to speculate for a moment, the long-term engagement with God in prayer may have led to a growing conviction that should God give her a son, God would have the very special plans for that son. And if there was any truth in the speculation, then Hannah's words may seem less indicative of bargaining than of submission to a divine will she felt from God. Hannah's promises further that no razor will ever be used on his head. According to Numbers, this was to signify their consecration by abstaining from three things: drinking the fruit of the vine, cutting the hair, and touching a deadly body. Whether Hannah was dedicating Samuel as a Nazirite remains a point of debate, but it is clear she was dedicating him for a lifelong service to God. I can kind of see where this is going. Okay, that's our time up. Any final comments or questions?
I find it interesting that with all of the bickering and the jealousy going on, that Elkanah didn't really do anything. or didn't appear to do anything. You know, maybe he just didn't know what to do, but you know, it seems like he would have done something more than just tell Hannah to, you know, to just eat and don't you want me more than you want 10 sons?
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting that he is definitely becomes a character used by God. But him and his sons, well, actually, that's Eli and his sons. We're going to get into them. They're a piece of work, let me tell you. But again, God uses them in Samuel's life significantly. So, yeah. That brings us to a close today. Thank you for having joined us.